Alright, how's it going everyone? So today I've got another post-practice video for you guys, and in this video I tried to choose poses where the torso is doing things that you would usually not see it do. So in this first pose, the torso is kind of bent in the middle so that the rib cage is tilted forwards and the pelvis is tilted backwards, whereas usually you would just see the rib cage being pointed straight down, pelvis being pointed straight up. So usually people get used to drawing the torso with the ribcage and pelvis always being in that particular orientation. So whenever they have to draw a pose like this, for example, where it's different from what they're used to, they kind of don't know how to do it. So that's why I went with a pose like this. And what's really important to pay attention to with a pose like this is the spine, actually, because I've talked about this a couple times before, but the spine is divided into three parts. You've got the cervical section at the top, which exists in the neck. Then you have the thoracic section, which follows the entire rib cage, or it's attached to the rib cage. And then the lumbar section, which is in between the rib cage and pelvis. When it comes to movement in the spine, the vast majority of movement happens in the lumbar section. That's where the majority of flexion and extension happens. A lot of rotation happens there as well. The thoracic section is able to flex and extend as well, but not as much because the rib cage gets in the way. And as you can see in the reference image here, there's a bend right around the area where her belly button is. And that is the part in between the ribcage and pelvis. And this particular orientation of the ribcage and pelvis is actually a lot more common than you would think. You usually see this whenever characters are trying to move. I assume it's because it's easier to maintain your balance when you pull your body in like that. But yeah, it's a pretty common thing. It's really hard to draw too if you're not doing a side view like what I'm doing here. If you're doing a front view, you kind of have to start dealing with foreshortening to show that the ribcage is going backwards and the pelvis is going up. So maybe a future video, a future pose practice will have a pose like that. We'll see. But also another thing that I did in this video is I started using a brush that actually doesn't have pen pressure. As you can see with this one, this is just the G Pen from Clip Studio Paint. Except I turned off pen pressure, and you can see that the brush is a lot more shaky. You can see that my lines don't perfectly line up as they would usually do. On the one hand, the lines look worse now, but on the other hand, it's also really good practice because, you know, if you want to be a master, you got to be able to do everything. You got to be able to work with whatever tools you're given. So right now, this is what I'm experimenting with. I've already noticed some pretty noticeable improvement in my line drawing skills, mostly when it comes to decision making. Usually when you're using a brush that has pressure sensitivity, you're able to kind of scratch around a little bit and try to find a line that you're happy with. But with this, there aren't really any do-overs. You just have to get everything right in one go. So, seems like a pretty effective way to practice, I think. But we'll see if it has any results a couple weeks from now. But also, a really cool thing about using a brush like this is that it's really responsive. Like, as soon as you put the pen on the screen, you get a line. So you can draw extremely quickly with this. My stabilization is also turned off, which helps a bit with the speed as well. But yeah, if you haven't given this no pen pressure brush a try yet, I would highly suggest trying it out. Maybe you'll really like it. And I think we're nearing the end of this particular pose. I didn't do a mistake correction in this recording, so I'll just quickly point out that the biggest mistake, I think, is that the upper body is not tilted forward enough. Either that or the upper torso is a little too long, which it's probably a combination of both, so that's something I'll have to pay attention to in the future. It wasn't that difficult of a pose, so hopefully you guys were able to follow along with it as well. Now the next pose is Mitsuri from Demon Slayer. This is a figure of her, and these anime figures actually seem like a pretty good way to practice poses as well. But the main reason why I wanted to choose this pose is because the torso is not facing us straight on. We're kind of looking down at it. Unlike the previous pose, the ribcage actually isn't tilted down on this one. Same with the hips, they're not tilted up. This is just a regular position for the torso, but what's interesting about this is that the legs are tilted upwards. Or not tilted, but it's rotated a bit up. And I actually put out a short for this pretty recently where whenever the femur rotates up, the entire leg gets closer to the aces point of the pelvis, and the torso will actually appear to get slightly longer because now you have the extra volume of the gluteus maximus that will extend below where the crotch usually is. It's kind of a similar effect that you get with the knee whenever you bend your leg. So normally you measure the leg from the crotch down to the bottom of the knee, and then the lower leg is measured from that point down to the ankle, or you would measure it from the crotch down to halfway down the knee, and then halfway down the knee to the ankle for the lower leg. But whenever you bend the leg, you measure the upper leg from the crotch to the most forward point of the knee, so the patella, and then the lower leg is measured from the top of the patella down to the ankle, so the leg will appear to get longer. For the upper torso, it's the same thing. Or not the upper torso, but the entire torso. It's the same thing whenever you bend your legs. It's a small thing, but it can throw off your proportions, so definitely pay attention to that. Another really annoying thing about drawing a pose like this is that the regular head measurements don't really work anymore, because now the torso is foreshortened, so instead of it being about 2.5 heads tall, which it usually is whenever a character is standing straight up, now it's maybe 1.5 heads tall. So to get that right, you really have to measure your reference correctly. And that's also why drawings from imagination usually end up wrong, because the proportions that you're used to memorizing, they don't work anymore. Now you have to memorize a completely different set of proportions, or you have to really understand the math behind how proportions work in perspective. And both of those things require a pretty advanced level of art knowledge, so for the most part you're not going to be able to do it right, which means just use references. It makes things so much easier. Also, another very easy mistake to make with this pose, I think, is not angling her left leg correctly. As you can see in the reference, it's at a very steep angle. It's actually, I think it's at a 45-degree angle if you measure it from the ground. So usually you don't draw legs like that because it's a pretty unbalanced pose. If a character stands like this, they're going to fall, obviously. So people aren't used to drawing that, and then they make the mistake of not exaggerating it that much. So yeah, it's a pretty easy mistake to make. I would highly suggest working on your observation skills if that is a mistake that you've made. I already made a video on how to observe better, so maybe that will help you out. Her right hand is also in a pretty weird spot. It's extended behind her body holding her sword. I wish I had some images or some other images of this figure so I could actually see what it was doing, but I got this image off of Pinterest, so, you know, I don't. This pose is also one that people usually make mistakes with because they're not used to drawing the torso from this angle. So they're not used to having the upper torso overlap the lower torso, and they usually end up making the entire torso a bit too long. So poses like this are definitely ones that you need to practice. And that's it for the video. Be sure to check out the description if you'd like to support the channel. We have a Patreon as well as a YouTube memberships link, as well as a Discord server. But yeah, I guess I will see you all in the next video.